This is Jessica Rhodes, founder of Interview Connections, and you are listening to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast with Jana Lunga.
This is episode 176, and today we talk about rocking the podcast from both sides of the mic. Here we go.
Welcome to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast, the show for entrepreneurs and small business owners who dream big and want to do bigger. Join some of the world's top entrepreneurs, internet marketers, and best-selling authors as they share their inspiring stories, their struggles, and give actionable tips that will help you build, grow, and promote your online business. Here's your host, Jana Lunga.
Hey there, how's it going? Welcome. And today's episode is not an episode, is a workshop, is a crash course. It's a sort of webinar, audio webinar on rocking podcasts, both as a host and guest. So if you're interested in podcasts, maybe you already have a podcast or you don't care about hosting a podcast, but you understand the power of podcasts and you're like, how can I get started and get featured on podcasts? And why should I get featured on podcasts in the first place? Then you're at the right place. And joining us today is a good friend of mine, is a podcasting rock star. She's a speaker, she's an entrepreneur, and she's the founder of interviewconnections.com. And I'm talking about Jessica Rhodes. The show notes for today's episode are over at janilunga.com/episode 176. All right, time to get started. Here is the interview with Jessica Rhodes from jessicarhodes.biz. In today's episode, we're joined by somebody who I consider a good friend, and she really knows a thing or two about podcasting, and not only podcasting, but really rocking the podcast from both sides of the mic. She's a podcaster, a speaker, and she's the founder of Interview Connections, the premier source for booking outstanding podcast guests. Not only that, though, I said it, she's a podcaster, so she's the host of Road to Success, the podcast producers, and she's also the host of the video show Interview Connections TV. As if that wasn't enough, she's also a speaker. She has been featured on places like Entrepreneur and at conferences like Mid-Atlantic Podcast Conference, Podcast Movement, and she's here with us. I'm so excited to welcome on the show, drum roll, Jessica Rhodes. Jess, how's it going?
Hey, how are you?
It's so surreal to be interviewing you. Because I feel
it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, indeed. Because we have interacted in so many different ways, by email, on Facebook, on Twitter, and then for the summit. And we met in person in Chicago. Was not only Podcast Movement, but Taste of Chicago.
Taste of Chicago. That's right. I was like, wait, Food Fest? Yeah, Jan and I painted the town red. Is that what I don't know what that means, but we were
it sounded
downtown
good.
eating food and drinking beer together. So we're friends in real life.
Yeah, no, I think podcasting is great because it really allows us to connect with people all over the world, but meeting in person after having been online friends and working together for some time, nothing beats that in my opinion.
I know, it's so fun.
All right, so Jess, I said it, you really are quite the knowledgeable podcasting gal, not necessarily only as a host, but also as a guest, because I said you created interviewconnections.com, and it's a service that allows podcasters to find great podcast guests. And I think maybe interviewconnections.com just is a good conversation starter, because I think it's something that is very, very valuable for all the members of the podcasting community, so hosts and guests. So the first question I have to ask you is, how did you come up with the idea of Interview Connections? Because, it's one thing to have an idea, but to turn that idea into an actual service and functioning business is a completely different thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it really goes back to my original intention, and my plan was to be a stay-at-home mom. I wanted to, when I was pregnant with my son Nathan, he's now 3.5, I wanted to leave my job and be a stay-at-home mom, but I also needed to have some kind of income. My husband works in nonprofit. We could not be a one-income family, so I went into business as a virtual assistant. At the direction of my dad, who is a business coach. He said, well, why don't you start a virtual assistant business? You can work from home. I'll be your first client. I'll kind of show you the ropes a little bit. So I learned a ton about business and marketing from my dad, Jim Palmer. And I did a lot of different tasks for him and some other clients as a VA. I was doing Pinterest marketing. I was doing client support. So for my dad, I was doing, sales calls for his No Hassle newsletters company. And one of those things around, April, he said, hey, I get booked on podcasts as a guest, internet radio shows, telesummits were big back then. And he said, why don't you take that task over? I think you'd be really good at it. So I said, okay. So I just said, all right. So I went to Google and iTunes, and I'm just looking for business podcasts and marketing podcasts. And then I would send emails to the hosts and tell them, hey, Jim Palmer would be a great guest for your show. Here's what he's an expert in. And then I just started booking interviews. I didn't know who was big. It's so funny because, ignorance is bliss. Like if you don't know who the big people are, you reach out without realizing it.
Right.
So I was pitching him to, nobody podcasters and then big podcasters. And then as the bookings started to come in, it was going well. He was connecting with more people, selling more of his books, that he started referring some of his friends to work with me. So then I got some other clients that I was, at that point I had 3 clients, my dad and 2 of his friends that I was booking for podcast interviews. And then I started just talking to more and more podcasters as I was doing that pitching. They would say, hey, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm a virtual assistant. And one of the things I do for my clients is book podcast interviews. And I just started to get some interest and started to get people asking me how my service works. And at that point, I'm like, I don't know. I was just so new. I'd been in business for 3 or 4 months. I was really, really new. And podcasting was just starting to take off for entrepreneurs. But I was also at a point in my business where I needed to scale and I needed to increase my revenue without necessarily increasing the number of hours that I was working, because I had a baby. I had a 4-month-old baby, 3-month-old baby, and he was, his nap schedule was constantly changing. And so I said, I can't just work more hours. And as a VA, some virtual assistants, especially if you can do email marketing and web design, you can make, $100 an hour, but I didn't really have the skills that allowed me to charge somebody $50 or $100 an hour as a VA. So I'm like, I can't make more money unless I work more hours, and I can't really work more hours. So what the heck? So my dad said, okay, what of all the services that you're offering? I was doing Pinterest marketing. I was designing infographics. What do you enjoy most? What's in highest demand? And what was the other one? What would be the most profitable? And I said, well, out of all the things I'm doing, booking podcast interviews is something I enjoy the most. It's in demand. People really want this service, and it has the potential to be more profitable if I change the way that I'm charging for it. So that summer of 2013, I changed my business to go from being a virtual assistant where I would charge people, an hourly rate for so many hours a month, to a flat rate for so many bookings. So I'd say this much money for 4 guests on your podcast, or this much money. I started just for podcasters. So I wasn't getting people on shows at that point. I said, I'm going to just start by finding podcasters, their guests. And then, fast forward 3 years later, the business has evolved, and I've added the service where I get people on podcasts as a guest, which I added probably 6 months in. And that's actually the most popular service I have. Everyone wants to be on podcasts as a guest. Even if you have a podcast, you're like, yeah, I could get my own guest, but I want to be on shows. So that's actually the most in-demand service. And I've grown out a team. I have 10 guest bookers. Yeah, I feel like I just answered 15 million questions that you didn't even ask. but that's like the backstory.
No, well, I mean, we all know that you are a mind reader. You use your
Sorry.
Jedi mind reading skills. No, look, jokes aside, thank you for really taking the time for giving us a bit of a backstory as of how you ended up launching Interview Connections. And I really like the fact that you kind of went from virtual assistant to actual entrepreneur and business owners, because I know, I mean, we have collaborated together with Interview Connections. I know that you have a team behind you, and I'm sure that the virtual assistant experience you had definitely comes in handy, even though now you aren't a virtual assistant anymore, but you work with assistants and you work with teams, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny. I was on a podcast about freelancing. So it was called, I think it's the Get Rich Freelancing podcast. And I said, I went from being the freelancer, being the virtual assistant, to I am the client of freelancers. My guest bookers are freelancing. And so I'm very familiar with like how to have, freelancers work for you. And then, tips on if you're going to be a freelancer. So it's been just a crazy journey to go from being that team member in somebody else's business to then having team members in my own business.
Right. Yeah, no, I bet. And just today, I thought, since you are the rock the podcast from both sides of the mic queen, I thought that we could talk about podcasting from both sides, because I know, and you told us you work with both podcast hosts and podcast guest experts. So, I think nobody is more knowledgeable than you and can give us a 360-degree picture. And 360-degree, by the way, fits in well with the
I like how you did that, Jan.
You saw. Well, look, the first question I have to ask you ties into what you said a moment ago, because you said, well, when I started out looking for podcasts, I just, I really didn't know much what I was doing. I was using Google and these kind of things. And I know that there are some people listening to you and I, entrepreneurs, marketers, authors, coaches, who want to share their message with the world. They want to tap into different audiences. They want to promote their latest book or their business or something like that, but they aren't sure how to get started with the whole process, because I think that reaching out is only one part of the process. So if you, Jess, were to say, let's say you and I are together, we say, okay, we want to be featured on podcasts. What do you think are the first steps? Is there something in particular we need to have before we start, or?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot. But I think the first thing, let's work on the mindset to know, because a lot of people that do not find success in this strategy of being a guest on podcasts are people that think this is a way to advertise their business, and it's not. Right. You can advertise on podcasts and you can pay podcasters and they'll do a live read and advertise your business. But when you're a guest on podcast, your first priority is to provide massive, valuable content to the listeners, to give as much information away as possible for free, because it's being a guest on podcasts, having a show, it's content marketing. And the way content marketing works for business owners is it attracts people to you who you've given a lot of free content to. So just know that it's not advertising, because all people that say, well, I've been on podcasts, but I haven't really seen a lot of sales from it. And I'll say that's because it's not advertising. You're not necessarily going to see a lot of sales after you appear on a podcast, because you're not selling. You're not advertising your business. You're providing content. The way that it works is that you go on a podcast, you provide a ton of information, a ton of value. People say, wow, that was so much great information. I want more from her or more from him. They go to your website, they subscribe to your podcast, they read your blog, they follow you on social media because they want more from you. And then as they get into your community, then they say, okay, wait, whoa, she's selling this. Gosh, I like her content so much that I want to see what she has to offer. So just the first thing is like knowing that it's not a direct response marketing strategy and it's not advertising. So you can't go on a podcast and expect like your business to blow up the next day. It's interesting because people will go on like huge podcasts like Entrepreneur on Fire or, shows with like tens of thousands of downloads. And usually what I hear, and I've heard one example of somebody that was on one of these large podcasts and they, got a really big client from it. But I hear those stories from small podcasts too. The effect that you feel are a massive amount of people following you on Twitter or sending you emails. But I have yet to really hear a lot of people that say they get a lot of sales from those big podcasts. So it's still the same strategy. It's just on a bigger scale when you're on a large podcast. So, but as far as like logistically what you want to have, having a one sheet is really, really important because it actually positions you as somebody that gets interviewed, somebody that goes on traditional media a lot, somebody that's on the news a lot, like they're the experts that are called in, they're quoted in large publications. Those are people that are putting themselves out there as a subject matter expert. Mm-hmm. So number one, knowing what the subject matter is that you're an expert in is very important. Like if you just say, well, I've done this in my business, but what are you an expert in? And then what makes you stand out? Somebody emailed me and introduced me to one of his friends recently, and he said about his friend, he goes, yeah, he started a business and then in 2 weeks had gotten over 6 figures in annual recurring revenue with only $200 marketing budget. That's a hook right there. I don't know anything else about him, but I'm like, that's interesting. I want to know more. So what is that hook about you or your story that makes people say, oh, that's really interesting and unique. I want to know more about that person. So knowing what that is. And then the one sheet, it's basically a 1-page PDF document that prepares the podcaster for the interview. So you give them your bio, something that they could read to introduce you to the show. You give them your potential interview topics, your potential interview questions. And it's not like they're going to ask you all these questions, but when you're pitching yourself to a podcaster, you want to give them an idea of what an interview with you might sound like. So you want to write those questions, write those topics out just so they can get an idea of what they could talk to you about. And then the contact information, like your Skype name, because most podcasters are going to connect with you on Skype. And then also your phone number, mailing address, email address, websites, and social media links. Having all of that on a one sheet is the first step to take if you want to be booked, because whether you're pitching yourself, you need to have that one sheet with your pitch. Or if a podcaster requests you and says, hey, I want to interview on my podcast, they're going to say, can you send me your bio? Can you send me your questions? They're going to ask, so have a one sheet so you can just send it to them and you don't have to go through and like find all the stuff every time separately.
Oof. Jess, my headphones are on fire. You are dropping so many value bombs, and before
I'm rocking the podcast.
you certainly are. And before I comment on the one sheet, which by the way is something I learned from you. I want to say something about your first part of the answer, because you said it. Podcasts aren't about direct response marketing. They aren't about expecting that, okay, I have a new book coming out. I'm going to go on this podcast and I'm going to sell 100 copies of my book. It doesn't really work like that. And you said it. The idea is to do content marketing, to attract people toward what we do, toward our personality, our message, our newsletter. And Jess, I didn't tell you this. So, people can see that we're really transparent, but I mentioned the interview we did for Roads to Success, your podcast. I mentioned that in my course, How to Create Your First Funnel. I mentioned it as a case study because I said that podcasts do attract the right people. Podcasts do convert. Like you said, it's not that by doing an interview, your business is going to change completely, because there are a million factors that go into somebody deciding to follow you or not follow you, buying from you or not buying from you. But to give people an idea of what podcasts can do in terms of also actual dollars is our interview, Jess, was 33 minutes long. And because of that, it converted to maybe 5 sales of the Podcast Success Summit. So that's
people that heard you on my show?
Exactly. So
wow.
That's exactly. And if we do the math, it's about $500. So that's obviously, I'm not saying that, okay, do an interview on Roads to Success and other podcasts, and every interview you're going to get, $100, $500.
That's so cool to hear, Jan. You're the third person who has been a guest on my podcast that said they got multiple sales in their business.
You know what it tells, Jess? It tells two things. First of all, that you are, as a host, you're doing a great job because people know, like, and trust you. And they know that the people who you bring on your show are top-notch. So they trust you. And then also it means that our conversation, me having an exchange with you, allowed me to share my message with members of your community. And my message resonated with some of them. So I wanted to share that. And you said about the one sheet, Jess. And,
Hold on. Before we move on, I need to say, how many downloads, how many times do you think your interview on my podcast was downloaded to get that many sales?
Good question. But
Take a guess.
I don't know. Before I give you an answer, I can tell you because I said I mentioned it as a case study. So if I remember at the top of my head, our interview went online on May 4th and I got, was it 3 sales on May 4th, 1 on May 5th and 1 on May 6th.
Wow. So they were all people that heard it the first week.
First few days. As of the download question, that's a good one. I don't know. Give me some hint. Is it around 100 people, 150 people?
Well, it's interesting. So you said the sales all came in like the first
48 hours.
48 hours. So May 4th, because I'm actually showing, because I have the all-time downloads for the episode, but if all those sales came in the first 2 days, then we're talking, wait, hold on, let me add it up because this is super interesting. A lot of people are like I just interviewed Jen Briney on my podcast and her episode went live today. And she's like, people don't want to talk about downloads, but it would have been really helpful for me if people told me because I want to know what's good and everything. So you made 5 sales after less than 100 people downloaded that podcast.
Conversion rate, baby.
And I mean, that's amazing. And now, several months later, that episode has been downloaded 403 times.
Nice.
But with less than 100 downloads, you made 5 sales. I'm going to make you record that as a testimonial because people are always saying, but I was emailing with somebody today, a prospective client who's just been kind of kicking the tire and I don't know. I really want to be interviewed, but I don't know if I want to pay to have you book me, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, she goes, I know the audience size doesn't matter, but really what's the audience size? She really keeps putting weight on that. And I'm like, I don't know how many times to say it or in what ways to say it. The size of the audience is not as important as the target audience.
Exactly.
So Jan, you selling the Podcast Success Summit, Corey Coates with Podfi Productions, a podcast production company, and then David Ralph, who has a course about being a good interviewer. You guys have all been guests on my show, and you've all made sales when less than 200 people had downloaded those episodes because you were in front of the exact right target audience, podcasters and entrepreneurs interested in being guests and having podcasts. So I don't know how many times to say it, but if you're in front of the target audience, there could be 50. I bet you sold some Podcast Success Summit before 50 people had downloaded the episode. On May 4th, I had 46 downloads of that episode, the day it went live.
There we go.
And you said people had bought it and then the following 2 days. So it's amazing.
Well, yeah, and I have to give kudos to you. And it's interesting that you touched on the audience size because I think, there is a lot of misinformation in the industry and people tend to focus on the numbers. But like you said, it's about the target audience. And then it's also about keeping in mind that if we were to do this interview face to face and we would have 30 people showing up. Man, that's 30 people. So stop treating downloads as numbers and think about those in terms of people. And one thing I want to add about this, Jess, is for people to also understand how powerful podcasting can be, is that, for example, in our case, the Podcast Success Summit was kind of a time-sensitive thing because it had a beginning date and end date. But I'm pretty sure if that was something evergreen, I mean, it's still available, but if people could be joining all the time, I'm sure that, the numbers would have been even better. But for me
Right.
personally, I had a great time, and there was some conversions, which really shows people that, if you are talking to the right person and they are the right type of people listening in, great things can happen. So you can attract prospects, you can grow your email list, you can even increase sales. Again, if you're in front of the right people. And Jess, the one sheet you touched on, I think it's so critical because, you're a podcaster, you do interviews. I'm a podcaster, we do interview. We know that the easier our potential guests make it for us to learn more about who they are, the more likely we are to say yes, because we immediately get a kind of a snapshot of who they are, what they're doing, what their expertise is, and whether they are a good fit or not. Because if we have to spend the time to go and check out the website and maybe the website isn't well organized or is outdated and things like that, it makes it hard for us. So you said it, Jess, the one sheet should have a bio, a list of recommended topics, contact information, and then you said it can be a PDF. And I'm going to make sure to link to mine as an example. And I learned it from you, Jess, from you and your team. So if you're here with Jess and I, and up until now you have been emailing podcasters and try to be featured on podcasts, just take a moment to check out the show notes. You find the links to everything Jess and I are talking about, and take a look at the one sheet and try to craft yours. Okay, Jess, so you said it. Once we have clarity on who we want to talk to, we know what we are an expert in, or we know what are the stories we think could be interesting for podcasters. We have our one sheet. Where can we look for podcasts? This is a bit of a rhetorical question, but still.
Okay. Where can you find podcasts? So iTunes is sort of like the phone book for podcasts.
Right.
Every podcast is in iTunes, but unfortunately the search function of the iTunes store is pretty bad.
Right.
Seriously,
I
you
agree.
could Google, you could write the exact title of a podcast and it might not be the first result. Right. I don't know why they don't improve that. But yeah, iTunes is where all podcasts are. A good first step is just to go into iTunes store, look at the podcast section, and go to the category in which your target audience would be listening to. So if you're like an entrepreneur talking about marketing, you'd go into the business section and then look at the marketing and management and marketing podcasts. So, right there, that's kind of the start of it. There's new and noteworthy, there's what's hot, there's top podcasts, and then you can just view all podcasts. And that's obviously going to give you a whole bunch of shows. From there, you want to make sure you're only pitching shows that have guests and that are, the content is relevant. They're currently publishing. You're going to find podcasts in iTunes that haven't published in 3 months. They're probably not the best shows to pitch because they're currently, they're not really actively podcasting. Right. But, it's also good to find podcasts by searching for people that might be friends in common. So if you have a friend, like, if I wanted to go on podcasts as a guest, which I do, I could search Jan Alunga in iTunes and see what other podcasts has Jan been on. Jan talks a lot about podcasting. So if another show was interested in talking to Jan about the Podcast Success Summit, I know they're probably going to be interested in what I have to say about guests and interviews. So think about what other people are out there who are similar to you or have relevant content to you, and then search their name to see what podcasts have interviewed them. So that's another way to find shows. And then there's lots of different directories. Like there's a site called marketingpodcast.com. Shepodcast.com is a directory of women's hosted podcasts. And then there's Blog Talk Radio, Voice America. There's a lot of internet radio websites with a ton of shows as well. So there's a lot of different places to find them, but my biggest tip is to think of what similar experts are out there and then see what shows they've been on. And that gives you a way to personalize your pitch a little bit. If I were to pitch a show that interviewed you, Jan, I'd say, hey, Jan and I are great friends. We went to the Taste of Chicago together and we've interviewed each other, just so they have a sense. The host doesn't say, oh, who's this person coming out of nowhere? But they immediately see that, oh, there's somebody in common. And just one last thing about that, be careful name dropping, because if you're name dropping somebody who like, like, oh, I love this person, but they don't know who you are. I mean, that you're just getting into some sticky areas. Like, you don't want to be name dropping people and then have that person find out and say, stop leveraging my name for your benefit when I don't even know who you are.
Yeah, I mean, look, Jess, I think you are on point, and you said it. It's good to find a common thread. So that could be, as you said, if I were looking for podcast interviews, I would and I see somebody who has interviewed my friend Jessica Rhodes. I can say, hey,
you can name drop me on.
Thank you. Likewise. And I know that you and I are actually friends. So I know that that's something I could do. If somebody doesn't, like, let's say if you want to be interviewed on Roads to Success, but you don't see anybody who well, you know me, but if you don't know anybody, I think something you could do is start to connect with Jess, for example, on Twitter. So you find her at Jess Rhodes Biz and start listening to her show. Start to enter her sphere, right, Jess?
Right? Exactly. Oh, that's 100% accurate. Listen to the podcast, get to know the host a little bit. I mean, and it bugs me the most when I get bad pitches, because if you spend 2 seconds on my website, I talk about how to pitch podcasters.
Right.
So if you're going to do it really badly, don't pitch me badly, because this is literally what I teach people how to do. And just take a couple seconds to see what kinds of episodes are they putting out. Like, I'm clear, like, if you look at the last 10 episodes that I've done, you can see they're very specific about podcasting. And then when I get a pitch of somebody to talk about like how to grow your business and like really general and not for my target audience, I'm like, this has nothing to do with what my show is focusing on right now. Right. Maybe I did an episode about this a year ago, but that's not relevant anymore. So just, and then as a caveat, you might think, well, maybe it's still a good fit. Just say, hey, like, I see that you've been podcasting about this topic. I want to recognize that, and like, just tell people, hey, I realize that. Or if they haven't had guests on in 2 months, but you realize they were doing interviews for a while, just write, hey, I see that you haven't been interviewing anyone for a while. I'm not sure if you're still looking for guests or if you've just been doing solo. Like, just recognize it so they know that you didn't totally ignore what they're doing on their show. And just acknowledge that you know what's going on, but you're still going to pitch anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you're on point, because I know I've done so that, for example, there were podcasts that I thought the target audience was perfect for my message, but the content of the show wasn't my main area of expertise, but still It was an area where I had something to say. So I would say, I usually talk about podcasting, but I'm also very passionate about sharing my thoughts on, and then I would say, the topic of their show. So like you said, it's really, I think if we, as those who make the pitch, we actually show the host that, hey, we are taking the time to, we've put in the time to do some more research, check out your show, listen to your show, see what you and your community want, what your show is about. We increase the likelihood of having the host say yes. So, Jess, I have to ask you, what would you say? I mean, you've already touched it on a bit, but what would you say are some of the common mistakes entrepreneurs, marketers, people who pitch podcasters make? I mean, I know you would have maybe like 100 million, but do you have a few?
So the mistake that people make when they're pitching podcasters, I think the biggest one is not listening.
Right.
Like, is just not listening. It's as little as, and I just mean like listening in general, not just listening to the show, but when you, like, I'm an active listener. I was talking to a client, and as he was talking, I was like, and he would stop and say, oh, what were you going to say something? I said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just actively listening.
Yeah, same
like,
here.
and so think about it when you're emailing, think about how you can actively listen, like literally acknowledging, I saw your podcast and I noticed that your past several episodes are about this. Like, show that you actually did a little bit of homework. When you send pitches to podcasters that are general and that don't demonstrate that you did any lick of research at all, that's a huge mistake because podcasters don't want to feel like they're just giving you publicity. They want to feel like you're actually bringing value and that you're someone that they actually want to connect with. So just do a little bit of listening, do a little, honestly, you could do this in 5 minutes. I mean, the more time you spend on getting to know the podcaster before you pitch, honestly, the better the pitch will be. But if you strategically spend 5 minutes, read through their website, listen to a couple minutes of a few different episodes, you can get a sense of what their show is about and then acknowledge that, like actively listen in the email when you're writing that to them and then follow up. I mean, you can't pitch once and then expect nothing to happen. We had a client the other day that emailed me and his guest booker is on our team is David. And he goes, "Hey, Dave," like he emailed me and David and he said, "Hey, the show that just interviewed me said that you emailed them 8 times."
Oh, well, that's following up, right?
And then the host was like, "Okay, you're being so persistent." Like, yes. So, I mean, occasionally, like I had one host that called me and was like, "Listen, one of your guest bookers has followed up way too much," but then he said yes to the guest anyway. So you do have to be persistent. There's a saying, a timid salesman has hungry kids.
Right.
A timid pitcher gets no interviews. So you do have to really go for what you want. Know that, okay, some podcasts are not going to like how persistent you are, but you're not going to get what you don't go for. So you do have to follow up and be persistent with people until you get a reply.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, Jess, you're right on the money there. And we all have busy times. Maybe we are on vacation or at a conference. So there can be million reasons why we don't reply to an email immediately. So you shouldn't be afraid, like you said, Jess, to take a moment to follow up a few days after you send your initial email or the week after, definitely. And also, if you are using social media, don't be afraid to let people know over there. I do this sometimes, Jess, where maybe I would send an email and then I would tweet at the person, you've got mail with the an emoji or something. Great. And it's like, it's a non-intrusive way to let them know, hey, you're gonna find something in your inbox that you may want to check out. And Jess, this has been so great. I think this has been really kind of a full immersion into...
This has been like a webinar.
Yeah, exactly. An audio workshop on what to do to be featured on podcasts. Now, Jess, in this final part of the conversation, I would like to look at the other side of the coin and think about the host's perspective. So you and I, Jess, are starting a new podcast and we are looking for guests. So I think that some of the things that go into finding great guests are similar to what you told us for finding great podcasts. So what does our show discuss? What do we want our listeners to get out of each episode? And that helps us. But there is something in particular that I know you talk about, I think even in one of the interview Connections TV episodes, where you talk about the type of guests to go after. So I think that especially when we start out with a podcast, we want to go after all the influencers, right? Mm-hmm. But
when you have a business podcast or, podcast for your business, you need to be interviewing guests that are going to provide value to your listeners. And they may or may not be the influencers. And I felt very excited because I heard Dave Jackson quote me on the School of Podcasting, his podcast.
Saw, yeah.
Did you listen to that episode? It was this week's episode.
No, I saw from Facebook. Yeah.
I was like, oh, there's me. He grabbed a clip. I don't even know where I said it. But what I said was there are not A-list guests, B-list guests, and C-list guests. There are guests that are good for your show.
Right.
There are guests that are good for your show. So I usually encourage people to focus on who their community is. Use your podcast as an opportunity to spotlight people in your community, like your clients. Once you get going after a while, like who's actually listening to your podcast? See if you can bring them on. I remember when I interviewed Caitlin Pyle, who was a client and somebody who listens to my podcast. I interviewed her and she's like, this is so cool. Like I've been listening to you and I'm on the podcast. And I bet you that she's way more likely to want to promote that episode than somebody who was an influencer and who I was trying to get on the show because I want to be, connected to somebody famous. So really focus on people in your community, interviewing like your clients. Allie Brown's podcast, Glambition Radio. I mean, she's super well known. I'm sure she has a really big audience. Every episode, I realize that her guests are like her clients. They're people that are coaching with her and people that have gone to her events. Like she is turning the spotlight on people that have invested in her. And then in turn, she's putting the spotlight on them, which is really, really cool. So focus on people in your community. But then, hey, I mean, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be interviewing guests that like are not your clients, but think about what value your listeners need. Like, what do they come to your show for? Like interviewing people like, the three people that I named here, like you, David Ralph, and Corey Coates, who have all gotten business from being on my podcast. You guys are not clients. But you all have information that's super valuable. Like I know that people listening to this podcast want to know how to edit their show better and have a better podcast. Like I know they want to learn more about how to be a better interviewer. So I'm going to interview people that have that information. And in turn, I get more listeners from it. They share the show more. And then my guests get some business from it as well, which is great.
Yeah, and we aren't then afraid to help out whenever it happens that an email from Jess Rhodes hits my inbox or I see a Facebook message. But I think you're really on point with what you just said, and I think it's also important to keep in mind that you said it is about the listeners first and foremost, and you mentioned a couple of podcasts. I'll make sure to link to those as well in the show notes. And it's about the listeners first. And we all know that, we all want to interview all the quote unquote big dogs when we start out. But you said it, there aren't any A-listers, B-listers, C-listers when it comes to guest experts for a podcast. There are only the right guests or guests that aren't a good fit. That's the only thing. And also, I think that by starting to maybe change the mindset a bit and focusing on really people who have a valuable message to your community, oftentimes you're going to find that those who may not be perceived as A-listers or influencers are actually those that are more likely to, first of all, share your interview continuously, number one, and number two, collaborate even more.
Yes.
So if you organized a virtual summit, like I did, guess who was on the summit? There were many other people who, some people may think, okay, I've never heard of them, but you and I have such a great connection that is always so fun talking to you. So, if we can take that beyond a simple interview, it can be fantastic. So I would really encourage you, if you're here with Jess and I, and you're enjoying this conversation, I would encourage you to do two things. The first one, again, make sure to connect with Jess on Twitter at JessRhodesBiz. And the second one is, when you look for guests, start to think beyond the interview. So think about, okay, if you click while you are having the interview, if you're having a great time with this person, try to use that 1 minute or 2 minutes after the interview and see if there is an opening for a possible collaboration. Maybe it's a joint webinar or something like that. So Jess, do you want to take a second to talk about the power of the post-interview time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Some people call it the green room chat. The conversation that you have when the recording is not on, the conversation that only you and the host are talking about, or you and your guest are talking. And that's really an opportunity to get to know them. And the way the green room chat before the interview, what you want to talk about is like, hey, and if you don't know the host, like, tell me quickly, like, what do you do? Who's your target audience? Is this your main business? Is the podcast your business, or do you have a core business and this is marketing for it, or is this for fun? Like, just get to know the host a little bit. And then especially after the interview, like if there's not a hard stop, which, always ask people, hey, do you have a hard out? Do you have a hard stop? You have a couple minutes to chit chat a little bit, get to know them. Don't hang up right away.
Okay, bye, thanks.
Yeah, like get to know them a little bit, like ask them, hey, and then you have a chance as the guest, you can figure out, like, you can kind of get their reaction a little bit. Like they might actually say, wow, that was one of my best interviews. Like I had somebody the other day who was like, that was one of my best interviews I've ever done. I mean, that was super awesome to hear. So just take advantage, like just be friendly, chit chat a little bit, get to know them, get their mailing address so you can send them something in the mail, ask them when the show is going to go live because you'd really like to promote it. Like just be conversational. Don't just sell yourself. Don't be like, yeah, and I'd really like for you to, buy my course or become a client of mine. But you can start to get a sense. And, an interview that I did like a couple months ago, we chit-chatted a little bit, and I wasn't like pushing my services or anything. But then he emails me and was like, oh, I keep thinking about our interview, and I really think that I might need to hire you. Like he came back to me and said he kept thinking about it, but I hadn't pushed it at all. So that green room chat is really, really valuable.
I love it. Just thank you really for sharing your knowledge with us. And I think what is so interesting about what you just said is that we can do so much by doing very little, meaning we can simply ask if we are the guest, we can simply ask the host, okay, make sure to let me know when the interview is online, because I consistently promote podcast interviews, so I'll definitely add this to the rotation. Or if you're a host, you can, and I do this quite often, Jess, and I remember that I think you do this too, that is and not necessarily with everybody, when you have somebody, like you said, with whom you click well, I would ask, hey, okay, Jess, I say, first of all, I always thank the guest for their time. And I say, are interviews something you enjoy doing? Because I know a couple of podcasters and I think you'd be a great fit for their show. And 99% of the time, people really appreciate that. They're like, yeah, absolutely.
Totally.
I wouldn't mind. So those are the people, by doing something so little, because to send an email, it takes a couple of minutes at the most, you're gonna put yourself in a position where you actually stand out. And when it's your time for, maybe you want to invite them back on the show, or you have a webinar and you think they would be a great co-presenter, or whatever, maybe you're organizing a virtual summit and you're reaching out to them, they're definitely gonna remember you, and they're more likely to say yes, because you're helping them without expecting anything in return.
Exactly.
Man, this has been great. And Jess, I know that you and I could be here the whole week, dropping value bombs, but there is a couple of things I want to mention here before we wrap it up. So we mentioned your Twitter at Jess Rhodes Biz. You have also your website, jessicarhodes.biz. We have interviewconnections.com. And again, the links to everything Jess and I have talked about is in the show notes. And Jess, I want to ask you to take a moment to tell us more about this free resource you put together.
I have a free webinar. It is about rocking the podcast as a guest expert, getting you booked for interviews. If you guys are listening to this on a cell phone, or if your cell phone is within arm's reach, which it probably is, just text the word rock to 72,000. And I don't know when this show's going live, but I do them every month. So that will bring you to the page for my next live webinar, where I teach you how to get booked as a guest expert. And then they're live, so you can come on and ask me questions live, or hop on the video and chat with me in person. So that's totally free and filled with content, and connects you with me personally to learn more about this stuff.
Make sure to text. Again, you're going to find the instructions in the show notes. And in case it has been months since this episode has been published, make sure to still text, because you may find that webinar or another webinar. Like you said, you do them every month. And Jess, this has been so much fun and so much information you shared with us. I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for what you do for the podcasting community.
You're welcome. Thank you for what you do.
No, it's my pleasure. And make sure to check out the show notes and sign up for Jessica Rhodes' upcoming webinar. Jess, thank you. I really, really appreciate you.
Thank you, Jan.
And we are back. Jess, thank you. It was so much fun catching up and chatting with you. And thank you for sharing your expertise here with us on some of the things we should think about and do to rock podcasts from both sides of the mic. And you heard it. Jessica has this webinar series that she does, and you heard it. You can text the word rock to 72000, or in alternative, you can go to the show notes page of this episode, yanilunga.com/episode 176, where you're gonna find the link of the webinar page. So if maybe you aren't in the States, or you try to text and it doesn't work, whatever, no worries. Just head over to the show notes page where you find the link to that. And the link to everything else Jessica Rhodes and I have talked about in today's episode. This is it for today. Like always, thank you so much for tuning in. And if you don't want to miss on any episode of the 360 Entrepreneur podcast, make sure to check out the show on your favorite podcasting platform. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast. For more tips and tools, head over to www.janilunga.com.